although we live in an age of unprecedented data, none of it matters if we cannot make the data available in a secure and a timely manner. Also, we need to make sure that if there are any applicable regulatory compliances, then we meet all of those. We know we've talked on this podcast so many times about how the data and now AI stack is evolving and how the number of use cases are also increasing very substantially. As a result, the data and privacy aspects also need to keep in pace with that. Who better to talk about data and privacy than Matt Carroll? Matt, thank you for coming to this episode and welcome viewers to another episode of It Depends podcast. Matt, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So I know you're very busy. You are the founder and CEO of Immuta, and you're always traveling, meeting customers, and staying ahead of what's going on in the market. So if we can dial back into the very beginning of your journey with Immuta, and even before that, why did you start this company, and what was your goal?
Yeah, sure. So the idea, I wish I could say I just came up with it, but it's not true. Like I think any good company, we had a customer before the creation of the business. So we leveraged the U.S. intelligence community, and where it all kind of really started was for them to be able to make decisions at a global scale. The concept of application architecture was breaking down. We
Mhm.
couldn't share data fast enough. Users couldn't get on the data fast enough. So application architecture, right? If you think of classic three-tier, everything in a database, and you build a GUI, security validated, the rules were there. That just didn't work. It wasn't
Hmm.
fast enough. We needed to make decisions in less than 42 minutes, right? And so they they have a large budget. So they bought themselves $700 million, I think 692 million to be exact, of AWS. They built their own three regional, node architecture. And when they did that, they tried to throw all the data into S3. And then each of these, think of it as business units, said, hey, let's all, rather than having a application architecture, let's do a converged data architecture. We all could maybe share data in S3 buckets and use it. And it didn't work. Why? Wasn't the technology. It was there was too many policies, too many users, too many data sources, too many policies. The business didn't know how to determine what the rules were at that point. And there are too many rules. And
Mhm.
so data scientists couldn't do anything and they couldn't get access to data. And it went back to the way it was. So to solve that problem, the CIO of that organization asked me, hey, just make it happen.
Hmm.
And I was like, I don't know what that means. I can't come back and work in the government and doing this. My wife will divorce me. So, but eventually consulted. And what we found, if you think about the journey, is you converge your data architecture, data mesh, lakehouse, all these terms, but you come up with a converged data architecture, but then you need to change your business processes.
Hmm.
Immuta was created to change the business processes around how the governor, those who dictate the rules in the data, work with the stewards, those and the data owners, and security. So that way the consumer can just get access to data quickly, no matter the operational, contractual, or regulatory rules in the data. So that was how we began our journey back in like 2015.
And Matt, where in the US government were you working? What part of it, if you can talk about it?
I can't go into the direct agencies, but I can tell you the U.S. intelligence community is
US
where it
intelligence.
all started.
I see.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I think I've heard you mention on some at some place you spent some time being deployed in Iraq. Is that correct?
Yep, Iraq, Afghanistan, been
And
been around the Middle East a day or two, yeah.
oh wow, wow, that's very unique. I don't think I've ever had anyone on my podcast who's served in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. So that begs me to ask you, coming from being like deep into the intelligence sector in the government, now you're on the other side, on the commercial side. How is it different and what's easier? And just what are your thoughts?
It's very different and identical at the same time.
Mm,
When you think about enterprises, IT enterprise and data enterprises are the same, right? You have fiefdoms of data, highly siloed, because that gives you control, right? You have domain expertise inside your business, right? So if you think of organizations like Central Intelligence Agency or National Security Agency, um, they have their domains and they have their own applications and their own business logic. It's the same as any commercial enterprise. I I would equate CIA and JP Morgan to being nearly identical when it comes to the CIO's day-to-day job.
Hmm.
The big difference, though, what I miss the most is mission. So unlike corporate world, where at the end of the day, cost and how we're going to expend resources is tantamount. In the government, especially in a wartime government, everything's about the mission.
Hmm.
So the money becomes a secondary factor, and it's all about the mission and the camaraderie to accomplish a goal. And even on the nerdy tech side, right? Everything's just about the mission. I do miss that a lot. I get some parts of it now and again, but as CEO, I spend more time with bankers and customers than I do the mission, but I miss that quite a bit.
What year did you start Immuta?
2015 is when we started the business.
2015. So it's 9 years, almost 9 years, I guess. How has uh, data security space changed in 9 years? Has it become like, are we finally reaching a point where things are getting more secure and easier, or is it still a long journey?
It's finally, I felt like when we started the company, there was literally 3 years. I remember there was a briefing in 2018 I had to give to certain investors,
Mhm.
and I was literally uh, thrown out of a room. And it was because I said that privacy and
Mhm.
security in the cloud will be tantamount versus production utilization of data in the cloud. Meaning, large enterprises are not going to throw all their data into cloud compute infrastructure unless there was good security and good privacy. And I was told privacy didn't matter. And I'm not sure I was right or wrong yet. I think we'll see. But what I've seen is a large shift towards understanding how data is being used, and the
Yeah.
burden of proof is on the enterprise to prove that. And I've always felt like we were 5 to 6 years ahead of our time, and I'm starting to see that world unfold. And I think it's unfolding because as more AI is actually being introduced,
Yeah.
um, real world use cases, that burden of proof gets far more complicated and important because
I
the
see.
consumer cares quite a bit. So it's changing. And the other thing I've seen change, and I think for any data architects or data engineers listening here, is what we're also seeing is philosophical changes as to how we do this,
Mm.
right? As we get to real cloud scale, separation of policy from platform is
Mm.
critical. But to secure and to apply good governance and to apply good privacy, it has to be embedded. So it's kind of a catch 22. You have to separate the policy logic from the compute fabric, but at the same time that you have to operate within a standard deviation of the performance of that compute fabric. So how do you do that? Because no consumer wants to sit there and waiting for their BI tool to take 60 minutes to load, right?
Correct.
So what I'm seeing is we are having to change our architectures to a way that handles security and privacy in an embedded manner, but we're having to deal with more users and more data than ever before.
Hmm.
And so we have to rethink. We can't write code to do this anymore. And there's too many decisions that have to be made on who can get to it. So we're moving from my belief is a deterministic world where we codify every potential use case, every potential end user and what they could see, to a risk-based world where we have to make the best decision based on the context that we have in front of us as to who should access what data, when, where, why.
So I see Snowflake when it came out, it added a lot of, recently they've added a lot of data authorization or security primitives. Databricks has done the same. How is that impacting Immuta's journey? Like when you first started Immuta, you had a certain vision of an architecture of how to authorize which users can see what data. But
Mhm.
then when Snowflake comes out with its primitives and Databricks and Redshift, BigQuery, how does that change Immuta's approach?
We push for it. So, I mean, we had many conversations with Christian at Snowflake and Ali and Dave and Adam at Databricks. We needed those hooks, right? Our value added Immuta is
Mm,
not the data access. Like we don't sell ABAC. ABAC is or attribute-based access
mm,
controls is merely a conduit to the value above, which is the access decisions, the business logic around who the user is and their identity, the data controls that need to be built by the governance teams, and then the auditing and monitoring around those actions, right? The actual ability to leverage attributes to then drive a data access control should live inside, a Snowflake, a Databricks, a Redshift, a BigQuery, et cetera. Um, but no company in their right mind should want to write code to do that.
yeah.
Um, and so I think we're the ones who I want to take credit for it. I hope that large volumes of alcohol that we consumed with these companies to drive their product teams forward was all because we thought we need those hooks to make sure our customers get the best performance. And furthermore, teaches those companies, those partners that we have, um, that security is incredibly important and that middleware vendors like us who could do all sorts of really interesting things with those hooks is an important piece of the market that they shouldn't own the end to those who run the compute shouldn't necessarily own all of the security risk because
Mm,
you need a third party oversight on them. So where it's changed our philosophy, though, to answer your question directly, is we have shifted from thinking about ABAC and policy-based access controls to thinking much more broadly around what are all the things we can offer a data governor, right? And the value a platform like ours, once we have those hooks in place. How
mm,
do we do automated monitoring, unified audits? How do we manage, risk, right? And provide compliance reporting. And that's the additive value we have on top of this compute across multiple compute platforms, as well as storage, by the way. I mean, we're
yeah.
pushing for these hooks to be available in S3 and Azure Data Lake Storage as well.
It's fascinating to see when you explain this because we are already seeing this massive disaggregation of layers in databases. It used to be everything was a monolithic compute and store, and then we, of course, separated compute and store, but then we are separating the query optimization, the acceleration, the semantic layer. So we are like literally in this world of having discrete components that you can buy from different places and put together. So it seems like the entire data security space is going through the same disaggregation or disassembly of different functionality.
I
Uh,
think that's very astute. I think that's the right way to think about this is data security is just far too broad of a topic.
Correct.
Is
Yeah.
governance, data governance, right?
Yeah.
And so um, I can promise you, Immuta is never going to get into the backup and recovery space, right? But that is technically part of data security and data protection, right?
That is
It's
true.
the same thing like data loss prevention, right? So DLP is a space that is changing quickly, right? It was a very broad category. So I think what you're seeing is far more nuance in
Mhm.
this, especially I think what's driving it is AI though. I know there's a big
Mhm.
hype train out there around AI, but what's happening is more end user functionality is being exposed that is not application centric, right? Their end users are able to ask very broad questions of enterprise data without it being a very specific app. And so we have to fine tune so cost optimization. Do you really want an end user running a query that's select star from all and every single time? Do you want an end user executing a model which is retraining itself and revalidating itself every, no, of course not, right? So cost control, performance optimization, you're seeing data quality is changing, right? What is the quality of data that can go into a model, right? So in security, we're equally getting nuanced. We're looking at, when you, instead of having 1,000 users on a system, what if you have 1 million?
Yeah.
Instead of having 100 data sources, what if you have 100,000?
Hmm.
And that scale is requiring us to fine tune who is doing what in the stack. And so for like a Muta, it's native policy integration,
Hmm.
right? And then the ability for the governors to decentralize who can write rules on that data. And then ultimately we need to unify the audit so we can monitor, because there's no way you're going to write code or build policy for every edge case. So it's thinking about anomaly detection. So when I think of the data security space, I think of a zero trust concept where you
Hmm.
have to look at who the user is, the query they're running, and the data you have. And you have to make a risk-based decision. It's not a binary authentication, which is you either get all of it or none of it based on the app you logged into, is dead for data. It's all about the authorization, that user, the data, you combine the two with the query and you make the best risk decision you can.
So I want to drill down on the risk piece because it's not intuitive. We are coming from this world where it was black and white. You have a rule, the rule gets fired or to permit access or not. So with risk, is that probability based or is this deterministic?
It has to be probability, right? Again, like we have several customers over. I mean, if you think about like JP Morgan's a customer of ours, right? They had 8,000 apps. On average, those apps had, let's just say, between 10 and 100 different data sources that would be
Mm.
commingled. So you can do the math, the number of data sources that they have to deal with in these converged architectures across, multiple highly complicated business units. You can't write every edge case. It's just impossible.
Yep.
And companies like Immuta aren't going to have the domain expertise
Mm.
to be able to build our own artificial intelligence to be able to discern their business processes and how to automate this, right? So there's never going to be a perfect world where deterministic, rules set forth who can access what. So we have to take a state of probability, which is why, again, I get back to the data security space has to be very nuanced,
Mm.
right? Some of us are going to focus on one aspect, others are going to focus on another. For us, it's how do we make the best decision based on the identity attributes, the attributes of the data, and make a context-based decision. It's also why we need unified auditing and why we need continuous monitoring, because they're not going to just query a Databricks or a Snowflake. They're going to query all compute vendors.
Correct.
They're, from a cost perspective, of course, they're gonna put data across each of these different environments because they want leverage on each vendor, right? So we have to unify across that. And so that's where we get into trouble, right? There's no way we can write custom rules for each of these environments either. What's normal for an end user? So this is where domains become important. It means natively be embedded and becomes important. So that way we can make risk-based decisions, right? It's a state of is it normal for this person to query this data source? Is
Mm.
it normal for this person to run this model on Databricks versus Snowflake, right? What is, based on a state of probability, normal and not normal?
Mm.
And then how risky is the results?
So
But
it's a,
that's the world we're going towards.
oh, wow. So it's a combination of data and the usage behavior or the
Yeah.
metadata.
It's
Is-
all about metadata, right?
Yeah.
So the next decade, in my opinion, so dear friends with Mike Olson, I lived through the cloud era age, right? I saw the change from, you know, classic SQL warehousing to NoSQL, in
Yeah.
Hadoop. Now back to warehousing, but in the cloud, right? To
Mm.
now we're moving forth into this AI era, right?
Mhm.
And if I think back in my days talking to Mike over a beer, and if anyone went to Hadoop World, right? The early days
You,
and
you
times.
talk about Mike Olson?
Yeah, from
Oh my
Cloud.
God. Yes. Love
Yeah,
Mike Olson. Yeah.
yeah. Best
Yeah.
guy in the world, craziest haircut I've ever seen.
Yes. Yes.
and all the cowboy boots. But like
Yeah.
the the point, I remember sitting down with Mike and talking about this a very long time
Mhm.
ago. So it's kind of funny. Conversations back in 2009, 2010, the same as today. What it comes down
Yes.
to is this. One, how do we make it as easy as possible for
Mhm.
any end user to be able to ask a question of a lot of data, right? And then two is how do I validate post facto the quality of that decision? Because that's all people are trying to do right now. They want to converge all their data, they
Correct.
want to ask a question of it, and they
Correct.
want to know how accurate is it, right?
Mhm.
That's it hasn't changed since Cloudera, right? That's what
Mm.
everyone's trying to do and as cheaply as possible. So I think again, it all comes down, it's all about the metadata, right? That hasn't changed since Hadoop, right? When we had Hive, we had all these ways by which we would run SQL against
Yeah.
these file system, right? So we're still trying to do the same thing. We want to run
Yeah.
SQL against large sets of data to get answers, but we also want to implement AI. But it's all about the metadata. It's about the user metadata. It's about the data metadata, and it's about actually the metadata about the logs themselves too,
Mm.
into a knowledge graph to make a probabilistic decision, right? That's what
Yep.
it's about.
So I'm so surprised you mentioned Cloudera and it took me way back. I really feel in defense of Hadoop, it gets a lot of criticism, but they showed us a new way. And so with MapReduce, HDFS, and Yarn, that was the first time we decoupled compute, store, and a control plane. Now, of course, cloud came and then it made this even better. And now with AI, we are further refining this process. But yes, we've been trying to solve this problem, the big data problem, for a long time. The
Yep.
question that I have though is that as these volumes increase, what is the impact of having a security control to the performance? Like, what overhead does it add if I have a modern data security platform in place?
Yeah, so this is where, and again, I'm a bad salesperson. So this is my honesty will probably
It's a
harm our
technical
company.
podcast.
But
Yeah.
but the thing is this is when again, I'm a huge believer in separating policy from platform, right?
Okay.
Because the platform could switch. And again, it's not
Yes.
just compute, it could be storage, right? The
Correct.
whole pitch of iceberg is I could lift and shift,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so when we think about that paradigm of shift, we're going to separate policy from platform as an architecture. First and foremost, I think that's the right paradigm. But as I said earlier, native is key.
Mm.
So performance, to separate where you have essentially man in the middle, right? To where I infiltrate and I capture the query, and then I essentially build a bunch down, a push down predicates, and then I filter results however I want, and then push it to the client. Never will work. Never,
Mm.
because the performance is just in
Correct.
very
It's a
in
proxy. Yeah.
there's lots and lots of little data sets. It's not like a
Mm.
big table concept, right? We have
Right.
lots and lots of little data sets. So that doesn't work. So we have to natively embed inside, and
Right.
there should be unredactions. Actually, it will probably perform faster, right? Than a native query against, let's just say, a Snowflake, right? Because I'm not having to return as many rows, right? Now, where there's performance trade-offs is in the concept of masking. But and I recently just had this conversation with a lady named Sarita at JP Morgan. I keep bringing them up, but they're a good example of,
Mm.
I mean, JP Morgan's the size of a country. So it's like, they're a good example of what happens when you get really big, right? So like, and I said to Sarita, I was like, listen, we can't do it the way the bank has always done it. You have to, in this new world, we have to stop building rules and building architecture like we're building an app. We have to go the other way around. Let's look at our policies. Let's look at our processes and work backwards. Does it make sense to mask an entire table and then demask it depending on who needs what in there?
Mm.
No, no, it doesn't. Because when you mask it, you've got a third party algorithm of some sort. There's lots of patents out there. And there's a performance trade off because the data has to hit that algorithm and then it feeds it to the client, right? Even though we're natively embedded in. So we have to provide a series of tools and techniques to de-risk. So again, I'm not going to say secure. I'm going to say to
Mm.
de-risk the state of the data in storage and in transit. And in transit, like, do you really need all this data? Can we minimize it? Can you have 10% of it, right? Hey, if you're worried about privacy risks, you can use things like k-anonymization to nullify certain cells. If you get height in there and there just happens to be someone in your data set that's like an anomaly, like 7'6", right? We can apply techniques to
Yeah.
remove those outliers versus just masking everything. Masking is good and needed, but there's many different ways to approach it without performance hits. But again, when the governance team is just for the past 20 years said, well, this is the way we've done it. We've masked,
Yeah.
right? Not so that we have to change our processes and we have to rewrite our global policy inside these enterprises and then educate the governance teams to make educated decisions on how to apply the policy to de-risk the decision. So that isn't a technical problem anymore because all like Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, Redshift, they've all added row and column level hooks into their warehousing. So it's not technical. It's now a business problem we got to solve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. But what I'm curious about uh, is the government, policy says that banks' data must be masked, and now we don't need to follow that. But can JP Morgan Chase make its own decision, or is it bound by these archaic government policies and it cannot go around till the government comes around?
I would love to see any government reg that specifically states you must mask this data. I would argue that if it is out there, it's an opinion.
I see.
And like anything else,
Mhm.
the conversation between your fifth line, your regulator, and your third line, your auditor, and your
Mm,
second line, your governance risk compliance, is a discussion and negotiation.
mm,
And fundamentally, in distributed architectures in the cloud, because mostly everyone is having to federate. I don't know of a single customer we have that doesn't have to think of the distributed architecture as a primary focus, right? Everyone is thinking about domains. They're thinking about, because at scale of data sources and users, which all of them are facing, you have to start to add metadata to create structure so you can start fathoming the scale, right?
yeah.
And so when you start to think of scale and complexity, we have to rethink the architecture itself, and therefore it gives us an opportunity to rethink the business processes and the rules and how we've done that. And so my push back, if a customer were to say, hey, this is what the government wrote, I would say, well, it's time we have that conversation with the government. I'm happy to come in and have that discussion because I just fundamentally believe if your goal is to mask everything,
Mhm.
and remove, you're essentially either performance degradation or you're removing complete utility, you're never going to be able to operate the business.
Yeah.
And so again, it's about risk
Yeah.
and it's about being negligent,
Hmm.
not necessarily grossly negligent. And I think that's a really important concept. It's somewhat of, I'm being a bit, flippant about it, but what I'm trying to get at is, let's just say you're disagreeing with a regulator on that. Regulator comes and says, nope, you're flagged, or auditor comes in, you're flagged. I wanted it masked this way. You guys rounded it or you did whatever, right? But I want a complete hashed format preserving encryption, what have you, right?
Yeah.
Super expensive, technique. Well, you have the ability to change it dynamically, right? So you're negligent, you're wrong, according to the regulator, but you could change it. You're not going to be fined. You're never going to make a regulator smile and happy. You're never going to go out to dinner and party with them, right? So your job is to mitigate the risk of the business. So, anywho, getting off my pedestal here is, it's always the ability to change it dynamically. Once proven wrong, that's your goal. Your goal should not be to live within the letter of the law of every regulation. If you did that, you'll never operate your business.
Hmm. Very interesting. Very nuanced.
Yeah.
Matt, we've talked about technology, we've talked about processes, so we're going to pivot to people side. Although I have burning questions about AI, but I'm going to hold off for now. The role of AI in some of the things that you talked about. So let's pivot to people side. Who are the buyers? What's your ideal customer profile when you go out and talk about Immuta to your various prospects and customers?
So when I think of this, this has been one of the more profound things that we've had to deal with, which is if you go back to the beginning of our day at Immuta, we tried to sell to governance teams, and it was difficult,
Hmm.
mainly because they don't have large budgets. So when you talk to a data governance team, they tend to support the business, but could also be, horizontal where they're kind of distributed, right? And what we learned very quickly, especially as in 2018, 2019, when Snowflake and Databricks started to take off, is um, the data IT folks. So if you think of IT, data org, right? Those who own Snowflake and Databricks budgets, et cetera, they needed us,
Hmm.
right? Why did they need us? I call it woe is the data architect. They can't, get into production with their data without an embedded security solution. It's not as though they can go to every business unit and say, hey, give us all of your data policies and we'll rewrite it in there. It's not possible. So you have to rethink the concept, right? Role-based access, which is the predominant approach that people took, was like, because it was isolated, right? You had those silos. So as long as you had this role within this group, we could give you essentially binary access. You had all or none of that set. So that changed. And so the IT organizations originally didn't like us because we were trying to build an end tool
Hmm.
for the data governance teams. And but as we went native and then made it easy for them to integrate into these cloud compute platforms they're purchasing, they liked us.
Hmm.
And because we easily onboard all these policies and rewrite them very quickly, because we don't need, unlike RBAC, um, with the ABAC approach we took originally and the policy-based theory we eventually evolved, you could write a lot less policies. What were 1,000 policies are now 50, right?
Hmm.
Manageable for IT to do. And so the data architect saw us fitting in as a data security platform inside this new compute platform they bought, whether Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, et cetera. And then they could then audit all that, right? So IT was happy they could audit who was using what. The platform was taking off. The platform owner got promoted because, yep, I got, whatever cloud compute platform du jour of the day, they got it off and into production. Here's now where things are changing, though. So that's been our life up to, I would say, 2 quarters ago.
Hmm.
But with AI taking off now, with all these end users, governance is having to get back into the game
Oh, wow.
in partnership with security and with the steward and with the data owner. There's a symbiotic relationship, right? So where our buyer is still the data platform owner,
Hmm.
right? Tends to fall into the CDO, but they have to build these cloud platforms. But now what we're finding is we have more users having to come to us to collaborate with one another.
Hmm.
And so now there's it's a team sport to determine, well, can we put this data in ChatGPT? Like, I don't know. Hey, I have an LLM, right? Like booking.com as an example. I can put my itinerary into a chat bot that's sitting as an LLM. Go to booking.com and see it. It writes it to a flat file, and then we get a strip out PI. Like, what is our role in there? Who are the different personas? It's not just data engineers that care about that. There's legal and compliance. There's security, right? How do we design that in an AWS architecture, right? That conforms those things. What are the performance trade-offs there? So there's many people, stakeholders involved. You need a system of truth as to what's the risk of that data, what are the policies on that data, who should be able to access that data, human or machine. So the buyer is still the data platform owner. The champion is still the data architect.
Hmm.
But fundamentally, there's users that have to be in the system, much like in Salesforce. You have it's bought by sales, put all your pipeline there, but marketing enhances it. Finance needs to review it, right? As we push deals to close, right? There's different personas that enter in and exit to accomplish a workflow. Immuta's future is to provide workflows for the governor, for the steward, for security. So that way, the platform owner can offer those services to the business and to each of these stakeholders to do an end-to-end job without getting in the room with each other.
So, Matt, talking about this is fascinating. I want to take an example, and I know Roche is one of your clients, and I'm sure there are many pharma companies in this space. So Roche is a company I've followed very closely because of their amazing work on the data product side and how they've decentralized. So let's say there's a clinical trial data, and then there is some gene editing, CRISPR data. So the domains, they know what the clinical codes mean, or the diseases, or diagnosis, and stuff like that. The central IT team does not know, have the domain knowledge. So now Immuta comes in, or any data access governance tool. Is, are we decentralized or are we centralized? Because one department may say this is sensitive, another department may say for them it may not be sensitive, or they may not even know what it means. So what is the role of a centralized data access governance in this distributed organization we live in?
No, that's I mean, well, one, no one's figured this out. So I want to be super clear.
Okay.
Organizations like Roche, if you think of their maturity cycle of how they handle governance, Roche is towards the end of that, where they made early investments in data mesh principles. They built domains. They have data product owners,
Mhm.
right? So it's not, you tend to hear about data owners, and they tend to be actually business executives. They tend to have more senior titles, and the liability of the data falls under them, right? But it's more of a secondary role. They're not actually in the business being a data owner. Whereas like Roche implemented real data product owners, like they own the data as a product. And so what we find is, but when we talk about this, data governors still don't have hierarchy,
Mm.
still don't have assignment into the domains. So if you think of data product owners, they're more like technical business stewards of
Mm.
data. They're
Correct.
technical enough, they understand the business and the domain, they can own it end to end. So they can own the business side and the technical side.
Correct.
Um, but they're still not governors. They don't set
Mm.
policy. We
Mm.
need to do the same thing for governors.
Mm.
Governors need to think about how can I find the data? How can I make it available? And then how can I make sure that it's secure? And then how I can meet audit, right? And what I find, lovely lady at Morgan Stanley, she said to me really well. She was like, Morgan Stanley, we're in their wealth management side. She said to me, um, I have to think about assigning SMEs. I have to think about assigning other governors. I have to think about, so any new data source coming into wealth management at Morgan Stanley, she may have to assign 6, 7, 8 people to it before it gets into the queue for a data engineer to start stitching it together and building a new data product, et cetera. So that's the world we're moving towards. Whereas the big enterprise will get the data, but then it's assigned into a business unit where there is a governor that has to
Mm.
assign a SME. They'll have to, so a legal, they may have to assign a data user, they may have to assign a consumer. We need to start enabling these governors to align just like data product owners,
Mm.
but we're not there yet.
Very interesting.
Everyone's
Mm.
first take on it is, hey, why don't I assign, like if we create a domain and we have this owner or steward, why don't they assign everyone? And the governance kind of left out. And so we have to change that paradigm.
Very interesting. And there's this whole concept of data contracts, and we're not going to go into that in this, but it seems like governors should own that because that's a KPIs or the attributes of what the consumers are going to see. So, but let's move on because I have so many burning questions. But I want to stick to your customers, and I want to learn more about what are some of the interesting use cases, or maybe even the use cases that you never expected, and it surprised you how customers are using data security platforms.
Well, you just hit on one. I mean, starting with like pharmaceuticals is really
Yeah.
important to me. Is upending how we handle real world data, real world
Mhm.
evidence, and for secondary analysis of the data, as well as clinical trial management. How do we get out of some of the archaic ways we were setting up trials and triple blinded studies and starting to manage it in the cloud? Because the faster we can get, a lot of people would say pharmaceutical companies is, you just think about it, it's this long, drawn out process of how do I deliver a drug or solution to market. we can shorten that. And we can
Mm.
shorten that by how do we automate things like HIPAA controls? How do we handle blinded studies of who can see what and have, proof of evidence that it's all controlled? How do we remove all the middlemen of all of the electronic healthcare records and laboratory results, et cetera? And how do we go straight from the provider, those who are getting the results, straight to the pharmaceutical company? You can start leveraging that, right? So that is an area where I always thought there'd be something, but up until last year, it never really took off. But we're seeing that explode. It's now our largest customer segment is pharmaceutical
Oh,
companies,
wow.
because
Wow, I didn't know.
all of them are applying us to real world data and
Yeah.
for secondary and tertiary analysis. Um, and we're able to handle whether it's for diagnostic and or research purposes. So those data contracts from a different perspective, but like literally the contract between the consumer and, or I should say the patient and the provider. Um, and then third is we're able to start to embed ourselves into these cloud solutions as part of clinical trial management processes. So huge push where I didn't expect to see us, but I'm learning so much about. It's really cool. It's customers like Mercedes-Benz. We're seeing other automotive manufacturers interested in like Cummins and others is as well. So like Cummins is obviously on the engine side, but like large scale manufacturing is one, the telemetry they get off the devices they're putting into market are just insane. And they're getting smarter and smarter about supply chain. But with that, you can't write policy for every potential market they're going to send data into. So how do you exfil data out of each of these markets
Yeah.
without having to hard code that? The second is to be able to have globally have different people analyze that information or have third parties manage it is really important. And so we're getting, especially like data marketplaces. If you're both in, let's just say Snowflake, why not just expose that telemetry through the marketplace? They could just
Mm.
pull it down. It's cost savings of the compute on Snowflake, right? So you can, without having to write, mine through that data, write it to S3, then
Yeah.
transform out of S3, put it right back to where in Snowflake again. It doesn't make sense. So we're seeing incredible use cases like that in manufacturing, especially in automotive.
Mhm.
Um, and then, the other big surprise for us, I would say, is we're seeing more and more of what I would consider, I guess, tail into media and entertainment.
Mm.
But like the things that media and entertainment are starting to get involved in, specifically around personalized marketing um, globally, right? Because everyone's trying to go global now. So we're doing some like really interesting things around privacy preservation. How do you operate in China, for instance, and work there, right? Like, how do you deal with data sovereignty rights?
Yeah.
And so we're making that far more simple and elegant.
Fascinating use cases. I would love to dig more, but I want to, in the interest of time, I want to ask you about AI. So I know that you have incorporated AI on the front end, so people, a lot of like I think you can ask to help you with policy definition, maybe.
Yeah,
Uh,
so we've started with sensitive data discovery and
I see.
how do we, because the thing is in sensitive data discovery on
Mhm.
that aspect of AI is most of our sensitive data discovery is not about PI and PHI, and that's where everyone starts, right? Is like clear classifiers within the data,
Right.
specifically unstructured data, et cetera. But in reality, most of enterprises, what they care about is not PI or PHI. I mean, it's important, of course, but it's their own unique data that organization creates that is potentially intellectual property rights.
Yeah.
Different ways that they operate their business that are considered is not every user in their organization should have access to. So how do you build, again, we go back to risk-based access versus pure deterministic rights. We have to also rethink how we're tagging our data relative to risk. And so that's an area where we've started to introduce AI within our platform to make that far more intelligent and far more business centric than generalized what you would consider, PI type data.
You know what I'm most excited about when it comes to AI? So you talked about how you are constantly monitoring and auditing the use, the behavior. So taking that data, and then you also mentioned, how Mercedes-Benz and all have a lot of telemetry data, and fine-tuning a large language model, and like doing that sort of constantly, because these LLMs are super smart, but they just don't have the proprietary data. If you can overlay that, then I think a lot of dynamic risk based decisions can be made in a more superior manner, in my opinion.
100% agree. And I think like I think of the iterations of our policy builder,
Mhm,
right? Is day zero is a command line interface, so it's all
mhm,
CLI. Next phase, we kind of pioneered this natural language policy builder, right? So
mhm.
think of it as like building a SQL statement, and it builds a
Yeah.
policy and it enacts natively inside there, right? This next iteration for us is I should be able to type up a paragraph. Generally, the things I want to do to the data and how much risk I'm willing to take. And it can apply policy. And I think, but that's one part of it. The second part of it is being smart as to who needs to oversee that data source or data sources,
Mhm.
right? If we're dependent on a human being, a super governor, to decentralize and tell all these other governors, and like the Morgan Stanley case of assigning 6, 7 people and having to know everyone and get into a meeting room together will never scale, right?
Yeah.
And so what we also have to do is look at all the metadata and leverage AI to derive what's the best approach to managing by exception,
Mhm.
right? A user should always be able to ask a question of the data. They may get zero results because they shouldn't have it. But then again, it's leveraging intelligence around that to say, no, I'll give you more, but then say, okay, here's why we gave you more.
Yeah.
Super risk data. The user has access to lots of similar sensitive types of data. This is normal, right? And then we can build policy, subscription-based policies based on that. We can do risk-based policy based on that. And it can just be temporary, right? For 24 hours, we'll give it to you. No human had to get in the loop. So that's where we're going is it's about time, time to access data, availability of data, and making sure you have continuous monitoring of data. That's what the enterprise needs. Those are the core KPIs.
And what is the role of open source in this? Because this whole open source thing's been like blown apart with some license changes recently, but some models are open source. You talked about Hadoop and Iceberg. What are your thoughts?
I think there's a need, but I think open source tends to be the lower level, right? I think where enterprises want to
Mhm,
live, they're okay with closed source, right? And I think where enterprises want to live is they want to get back to their core business,
mhm,
right? They understand their domain. So if there's models or there's frameworks needed to be invested in specifically to their domain for their domain to function, that is good. There should be consortiums within financial services, within insurance,
mhm.
within healthcare, within pharmaceuticals that drive that.
Yeah.
Um, but do I think there should be generalized horizontal, AI type modeling? I'm not sure. I think Iceberg is a great example of a low level tech that I don't think a company, meaning an industry based company, should invest in necessarily in their open sourcing things. But I think it's good for a vendor out there to build on that and then sell an enterprise service above it, and to create, competitive advantages. So I think open source is going to be low level tech. It's going to be in the database ecosystem. It's going to be very broad based, and that's good. But I don't think it's going to be vertically specific. I don't think it
Mhm,
should be,
mhm.
very niche domains. And so it's a balance, right? It's very, the other
Yeah.
thing I'll say to that is to any startup out there, any CEO that wants to go raise a lot of money, um, open source is ask, the Cloudera guys, open source is a very, very difficult model to monetize at
Yeah.
scale and sustain margins. So it's going to be tough to raise capital at scale to do it.
Yeah. So I like the way you're explaining it. So the lower you are in the stack, the infrastructure, open source makes sense because it creates some common standards and interoperability becomes easier. But the higher you go up, the value of an open source starts declining.
Correct.
and the yeah. So with there's so much going on. It's like every morning I wake up, there's some new news about some new model or some new technique. How do you keep up with all this dynamic flux we are in?
Yeah, like anything else, I mean, this has been the journey of my life. I've had incredible mentors that have taught me two things. One, read everything.
Hmm,
Um, but then two, don't trust what you read.
hmm,
Go talk to people. Talk and listen. Actively listen.
hmm,
I think I find in technology when people decide to have a conversation, it's usually they just want to tell that you want to talk, right? About how whatever you want to talk about, how smart you are or whatever. Listen. And what I do is every week I read a lot, but then I talk to two people a week.
hmm,
One is a practitioner, right? And then the second is someone who actually is a technologist in the domain. So a
hmm,
practitioner meaning inside of business. I want to hear from customers. I want to hear from prospects. I want to hear how are you actually trying to do this? And then I want to talk to an expert in the field. How are you trying to build this? And that's how I stay abreast of all the AI changes we're seeing in the market, and how companies are dealing with it. And what's really interesting is the profound thing that I found by applying that is I can make informed decisions in my own
yeah,
business in a way that is far more pragmatic.
correct.
It's less hype driven and more pragmatic driven around real deliverables. And so it's easier to prioritize our own roadmap. It's easier to prioritize my own marketing.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. I've learned so much. A great lesson, read a lot, but talk to people and listen more than talk. Listen and then form your own opinions because the technology is rapidly changing. So the more you read and listen, the more you can refine the way you are thinking about it. I have one final question before we run out of time. If you were not doing data security, what would be your secret passion in life?
So it's funny. Everyone would think I go back to the government or go do those things. It actually is food. So
Oh,
I, uh, at university, I studied chemistry, and I found in COVID, um, because you couldn't go to restaurants. And so I found that I'm very bougie when it comes to food.
hmm,
So I love cooking. I love the chemistry of cooking. And anyone who wants to talk to, you can ask anyone inside of Muta, get him up on LinkedIn or whatever. What's it like to do a dinner at my house? And I actually fly every single department in once a year. And we
hmm.
have dinners every month at my house. And I cook people food, but it's all driven off chemistry and the analysis of how people taste things. And so
Wow.
that would be my passion. I don't know how much money's in there though. So
I
that's my wife.
actually, Matt, that's the first time I met you was in Napa. You had an
Yes.
event before
Yes.
COVID and you cooked for about 100 people. It was this massive kitchen.
Yeah.
That was fascinating. That was just being there and watching you run around cooking. That was quite
I
a,
I took over a chef's kitchen and I think I cooked, I think 40 tomahawks,
oh
tomahawks
my,
and all that.
wow.
It was a lot of fun, but
Yes.
there's nothing better for culture than to serve
Yeah.
someone.
That is, wow. This has been so interesting talking to you and learning about security and life. I cannot thank you enough for taking this time. Such a pleasure. Would love to do this again some point.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Till next time. See you. Bye.